In the next couple of talks, we are going to discuss some of the science demonstrating the effectiveness of low-tech process-based restoration, and in particular the addition of structures, either in the form of post-assisted log structures that are meant to mimic and promote wood accumulations, or beaver dam analogs to mimic and promote beaver dam activity. And there will also be some reference to Z-dike structures. This is the general outline of what we're going to discuss the rest of this module. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of some large-scale restoration experiments referred to as intensely monitored watershed studies. I'll then discuss the Birch Creek study, which is an intensely monitored watershed study, where we developed and tested beaver dam analogs and the benefit beavers provide, and then another case study that also looked at a similar approach but for a different goal. And Steve will follow up with the Asotin Creek intensely monitored watershed, where we developed and tested the effectiveness of post-assisted log structures. And finally, Jeremy is going to talk about how low-tech process-based restoration can increase production resilience of vegetation in semi-arid environments. I am going to talk now about intensely monitored watershed studies. What are they and why were they initiated? Just before intensely monitored watersheds were initiated, a lot of literature was coming out evaluating the benefits of stream restoration. This particular paper in Science was an overview of how enormous the restoration industry is. They demonstrated that there were 38,000 projects that cost at least $15 billion during the 13 years that the study reviewed. But we know this is an underestimate because a paper that was published right after suggested that there were 42,000 projects in the Pacific Northwest alone. So with all this investment in stream restoration, we must be pretty certain that it works, right? Well, the answer to this is certainly not overwhelmingly positive, and there is actually a fair amount of literature reviewing what we know about the benefits of stream restoration. First, relative to how much restoration is occurring, monitoring is very rare, mainly only to determine if the project is still active. A much smaller percentage of projects actually evaluate whether targets are being met. Most of the actual effectiveness monitoring is also focused mainly on physical changes rather than the biological benefits that are the targeted responses. In the relatively few cases evaluating biological responses out there, results are pretty equivocal. For example, in this Palmer paper that reviewed 78 projects, they only found 2 of those projects showed any macroinvertebrate response. And for studies evaluating benefits to fish, similar results. The positive results are quite scarce. In addition, the restoration actions themselves are often implemented at a scale of reaches at best. So even if restoration was determined to have localized benefits, is this really going to have an impact on, say, a population of fish? It's often argued that monitoring is too expensive, but others, including myself, counter that it's much more expensive to do stream restoration if it simply doesn't work. So we need to spend some more time, some more money trying to understand if and why it works, and what scales are relevant to riverscape health. Ecosystem experiments can be used as kind of an example of how we might evaluate stream restoration. These experiments have been used to evaluate perturbations to populations, such as the addition of nutrients or predators to affect food webs, the removal of timber, or the addition of acid rain to affect watersheds. These particular studies here were enormously informative at setting environmental policy and recommending management approaches. One of the problems with some of these ecosystem experiments is they often use destructive approaches to create contrast of what a degraded versus a intact system might look like. But what if we could use restoration as the perturbation? Given that we spend so much money on stream restoration, why not use this as the perturbation that we evaluate whether it provides benefits to, say, fish populations? This is actually a more relevant experiment for many of the questions that we have about stream restoration. So it's in this vein that the intensely monitored watershed studies were developed. These were large-scale ecosystem experiments where restoration was the perturbation to evaluate changes to, in these cases, fish populations. These were initiated in the Pacific Northwest in response to listed salmon and steelhead. I'm going to be talking about the Birch Creek intensely monitored watershed study, and Steve's going to be talking about the Asotin intensely monitored watershed study. That both of these studies were studies that we were able to be a part of for the entire duration. In fact, they're still going on. We spend a lot of effort in these large-scale experiments to evaluate if change is occurring and why these changes are occurring, trying to understand the mechanisms, because the idea is we're not going to repeat these studies everywhere. We're just going to put a lot of effort in certain places, and we'll learn from those efforts to determine whether stream restoration can be beneficial. And in order to extrapolate when we don't have much replication, we have to understand the mechanisms, which requires some really detailed monitoring. So we do this both for fish habitat and for fish themselves. We spend a lot of effort tagging these fish with pit tags. From that tag information, we can get information like abundance, survival, and carrying capacity. In both the Asotin and Birch Creek studies, we've tagged over 100,000 fish to evaluate these responses. And again, the idea is that we learn from these studies and publish these results to inform future restoration.